Welcome, chat. All right, everybody. Happy Friday. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Dr. Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that everything we discuss on stream is intended to be taken for educational and entertainment purposes only, and nothing is intended to be taken as medical advice. If y'all have concerns or questions, please go see a licensed professional. So, hello to everyone who is new to us today. So I understand that based on the topic that we're going to be talking about, we're going to be doing a deep dive today into understanding trauma. And so we're incredibly grateful to Twitch for sticking us on the front page. And so some of y'all may be a little bit new to the stream today. Welcome. My name is Alok Kanoja, as I just mentioned. I'm a psychiatrist, and I'm also a streamer. So I'm a gamer myself, and when I was finishing up my psychiatric training, realized that people don't teach. Here's what I sort of discovered. We know a lot of stuff about mental health and mental illness, and that information is not reaching many of the people who need it the most, and especially for younger people. So if you look at the classic or the most common demographic of people who engage in psychotherapy, it is middle-aged Caucasian women. And so sometimes there are platforms, like maybe Twitch, where those kinds of people are a little bit rare. And what we see in places like Twitch and on the internet is that there are a lot of young people, there are a lot of ethnic minorities, there are a lot of people who would never sort of engage in mental health treatment. And those are the people that need information about mental health the most. That's why we stream here. And so welcome. And today what we're going to be doing is actually a little bit different, okay? So why are we talking about trauma? We're talking about trauma. Why is it a stream instead of something like a YouTube video? Because I hate to break it to y'all, but trauma is really the one topic that I think cannot be reduced to a 15-minute video. You can make a 15-minute video about trauma, but I think trauma is one of these topics that it's just hard to, you can't do the 11 tips to conquer your trauma. There are things you can do, but it's really something where I've noticed that if you really want a good understanding, if you really want a handle on it or conquer it, you have to have a good understanding of it. So we're going to do a deep dive today. Okay. So the other thing is that we're putting together resources for trauma. We're not quite sure what y'all need or what is effective. So this stream is sort of the first step in trying to offer y'all something. But there's a command for !trauma in chat, and y'all can sign up for what we're going to build. And that may sound kind of weird because you're like, wait, what am I signing up for? And honestly, we don't know. So what we tend to do here at HG is we try to offer y'all something. But one of the biggest lessons that I learned kind of in psychiatry is that medicine is a pretty paternalistic field. And we're working on that in the field of medicine. I think we've come a long way. But one of the biggest mistakes that we've historically made in medicine is that we have told you what you need. And one of the lessons that I've learned, one of the most humbling lessons I've learned as a psychiatrist, is that you need to tell us what you need. And it is our responsibility to use all of our expertise to build what you need. It's not for us to say, here's what you need. And hopefully in today's lecture or deep dive, or call it whatever you want to, you'll see what I'm talking about. Because the manifestations of trauma are many. And it's up, and so we just don't know yet. This model, by the way, has worked really, really well so far. And over the course of, let's say, 3 years of streaming on Twitch, y'all have told us what you need, and we have done our best to build it, and it seems to be working. So at this point, we have helped people in 132 countries. We've had about 12,000 people go through our coaching program, and we have really solid outcomes, which we presented at the American Psychiatric Association last year. We're going again this year and doing something even bigger this year at APA. So stay tuned to that. We'll you'll see what we do at the end of the month. And we're also helping a ton of people through things like YouTube and stream and stuff like that. So even our content arguably can improve some metrics of mental health by about 8%. So I know it sounds kind of weird, sounds kind of small, but at the same time, if you really look at like antidepressant medication, maybe improves things by about 30%. So even just watching our content appears to be helping people. We're putting together a study where we'll sort of study that formally. So we've seen a signal and now we've got to study it. Okay. So we need y'all's help to tell us how to help you. And we're going to do it. We're doing a lot of internal stuff. So go ahead and sign up if y'all are interested in more resources and things like that. We don't know exactly what we're going to build, but we're going to build something. Okay. So a couple of other things. Today is mental health. This is Mental Health Awareness Month. And so part of what we're doing for Mental Health Awareness Month is something like a deep dive because we think that this is what y'all need. So we're going to teach trauma because it's a topic that we've sort of steered clear of in a lot of our other content. So we're grateful to everyone who's been here. And we're grateful for all the support and things like that. Thank you very much for the tier 1 subs, Perfectly Panda. I know you've been here for a while. We love you, bro or girl or whatever you are, they, them. Whoever you are, wherever you are, we really appreciate all the support. Just so y'all understand, even today's talk has been the synthesis of about a team of like 10 people working on this for about 2 to 3 weeks. So even though it looks like, hey, Dr. K is showing up and I'm just like talking about stuff, there's a lot of stuff that happens on the back end, even things like the overlays, and there are custom overlays for the stream that our designer has been working on and things like that, all to optimize the delivery of information to make things as accessible and useful to y'all. So we really appreciate all the support that y'all give us. We do our best to try to keep things as economical as possible. 99% of our content is free, and we'd love to keep it that way. And so we really appreciate all the support that y'all send our way. And we also, a huge thank you to Twitch for, helping to elevate awareness about the work that we're doing. And hopefully we can help lots of people. Okay. Okay. So, shall we get started? What do y'all think, chat? Shall we get started? Okay. So today, we're going to be talking about trauma. And this is one thing that we're going to do sort of a deep dive on. I don't know if I'm going to talk for an hour. I don't know if I'm going to talk for 2 hours. Why are we doing a deep dive about this? It's because trauma manifests as so many problems. And it's the kind of thing where trauma is sort of a whole brain or whole person effect. And so you can't slice it up into one piece because trauma sort of affects every aspect of who we are, how our brain functions, how we form relationships. So it's the one topic that it's been really hard for me to try to chop up into pieces. What does this mean for you? What this means for you is that a lot of what I'm going to teach today may not fit right at the beginning because what I'm trying to do is paint a picture of how trauma affects a human being. And so I ask y'all to bear with me and stay through to the end. And hopefully what we can do is help things click. Okay. But it may not click right away, but we'll get there. I have faith in y'all and we're going to do our level best to get there. Now, it's taken me probably about a decade to understand trauma the way that I do, but we're going to try to really reduce that and distill that down to an hour, which I think is absolutely possible. Okay. Now let's start with this. So what is trauma and how does trauma manifest? And this is where, in my experience as a psychiatrist, trauma is the great chameleon of mental illness. And what do we mean by that? That means that trauma looks like all kinds of other stuff. So what I've sort of found working with people over and over and over again is that they come in with a particular problem, like a lack of motivation. Or even things like I keep on making the same mistake over and over again. Or I have chronic depression. I've been depressed my whole life. And it turns out, even things like addictions, all of these are trauma masquerading as something else. And so this may sound kind of surprising, but let's actually look at some of the manifestations of trauma, okay? Let's take a look. Does this work? Oh. Hold on. looks like it's picking the wrong thing. Give me a second, chat. Technical difficulties. Overlay difficulties. Browse. We need this. Okay. This should work now. Okay? All right. So apparently my child was using the iPad. Okay. So let's start with this. So when I say trauma is the great chameleon, I'm going to give y'all a list of things that I think, or not I think, there's a lot of data and evidence to support this, are actually related to trauma. Okay? So number one, what on earth? Chalkboard? Let's do this. Okay. Is chronic depression. Oh, yeah. Okay. So let's start with this. So trauma is the great chameleon. And what that means is that trauma looks like other things. So here's a list of things that trauma masquerades as. Chronic depression. So what does this mean? Man, I'm so grateful to have kids. And why is this so fat? All right, whatever. Okay. So what does that mean? This means that there are some people out there who say, I've been depressed my whole life. So in psychiatry, we understand that mood disorders like major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder are episodic. So they come and go. But there are some people out there who have been depressed their whole life. Okay? It turns out this is more likely to be due to something like trauma. There's also other interesting evidence to support this. For example, there was recently a meta-analysis that came out that challenged or made a very strong argument that depression is not caused by a serotonin imbalance in the brain. And if you ask them, okay, if it's not caused by a serotonin imbalance in the brain, what is it caused by? And they basically said trauma. Okay? So if you've been depressed your whole life or for extended periods of time, could be trauma related. Second thing, impulsivity or a lack of unifying direction. And how are these two things related? Well, I live my life kind of in an impulsive way. So I don't have any sort of direction. I just kind of do what I feel like in the moment. Sound familiar? Okay. Next up. Vulnerability to repeated mistakes. What does that mean? This means you make the same damn mistakes over and over and over again. Sound familiar? Turns out there's data that's related to trauma. The inability to take risks. Afford to take risks. Turns out related to trauma. Number 5, being a people pleaser. I'm a people pleaser. I don't know how to stop. Turns out, could be related to trauma. This is another one. Okay? Really important one. Something called the paralysis of initiation. What does this mean? This means that sometimes we can't bring ourselves to start stuff. We essentially live life in a reactive manner. If something happens to me, then I can respond to it. If I have some sort of external stimulus, I can act, but I can't initiate things on my own. Turns out it's related to trauma. Number 7, can't moderate relationships. What do you mean by can't moderate relationships? Or maybe can't engage in moderate relationships. So the relationships that I engage in are super extreme. So it's like, either it's like we're BFFs, or we're enemies, or I'm a doormat and this person like treats me however they want to. I always call them, they don't call me, right? It's like there isn't balance in relationships. Okay? Next thing, really common, is somatic problems. And what does this mean? That means problems with your body. And then you may say, but Dr. K, If you have problems with your body, isn't that a medical illness? Sort of. So if there is a diagnosable medical illness, then it is a diagnosable medical illness. If you do something like a biopsy and you have inflammatory bowel disease, and we understand that there's a pathophysiology to your physical problems, right? You have an illness, then it's an illness. But what we see in people with trauma is that they have all kinds of physical problems, which if you go to a medical doctor, they're going to tell you to see a psychiatrist. These are things like IBS, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, POTS, postural orthostatic hypotensive syndrome. There's all kinds of weird. So if there's something weird going on with your body that a doctor's like, I don't know what's wrong with you, chances are it's related to trauma. Now, if y'all are, hold on a second. I got to time myself. Okay. So if y'all are looking at this and you're saying, but Dr. K, this sounds like really common stuff. But I thought trauma was like pretty rare. Like, and maybe you're listening to this and you're kind of thinking like, wait a second, like I wasn't abused or anything like that, or maybe unfortunately you were. But this sounds like really common stuff that everyone deals with. And you are correct. This is really common stuff that everyone deals with, and it turns out that it's related to trauma. So let's do a quick analysis of some statistics, okay? Quick analysis of some statistics. So remember when I said that major depressive disorder may not be caused by serotonin imbalance, but could be related to things called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. The percentage of the population that has had adverse childhood experiences could be up to 60%. Now, what we've sort of discovered about trauma is that there are things called post-traumatic stress disorder, which requires you to have like 5 out of 9 of these very discrete things, like hypervigilance and like re-experiencing and nightmares and stuff like that. But it turns out that the mechanisms of trauma, like all of us basically have some kind of traumatic experience in life, right? Because our parents aren't perfect, schools aren't perfect, kids aren't perfect. And as we have these kinds of traumatic experiences, we don't have to have 5 out of 9. It can manifest as like 1 out of 9. So even if you're not diagnosed with a trauma-related illness because your function is not impaired, you can have this common crap and you can have like 2 of them. And it turns out that we understand the mechanism of this stuff relates to trauma. So you don't have to have been sexually assaulted in order to have these kinds of manifestations. And this is also really interesting because if we look at the research on trauma, we started doing research on trauma on people like prisoners of war. So this started with like in the 1940s when people came home from World War II. And we like did studies on veterans and they were like, wow, there's like a PTSD thing. And then in the 1960s, we had the Vietnam War and we studied that and we're like, wow, look, all these veterans are traumatized. And as people were reading about this stuff, like some psychiatrists and psychologists were like, wait a second. I have patients who were never in war. They weren't POWs. They didn't like enter into combat, but they seem to have some of these problems. And then we started studying childhood. And then we discovered, oh crap, it sounds like you don't have to be a prisoner of war to have these problems. You can grow up in particular kinds of environments which are surprisingly non-traumatic traditionally, but turn out to be quite traumatic. And we're going to dive into what those environments are that can result in these kinds of problems. And so even if you had a pretty good childhood or okay childhood in some ways, because your parents weren't frankly abusive, but maybe your parents got angry with you anytime you got angry with them, and they punished you for being pissed off. Or they were very, very strict, but also randomly very, very kind and indulgent. And it turns out that there's a lot of far more normal experiences which can result in this sort of traumatic formation of the brain, which is why this crap, like if we go back to this list, right? This list is like common crap, right? And that's what it turns out precisely to be. that the reason that these things are so common is because trauma is way more common than we realized. All right. So I'm not saying that all y'all have PTSD or C-PTSD or anything like that. But what we're going to do today is explain, how does this stuff happen? What is the environment that you grow up in that leads to these kinds of problems? Okay. So next up, first thing to understand about trauma before we even get into any specifics is that trauma is sort of a unique illness. And the reason it's so common is because trauma is not a pathology of the brain or the mind. It is a normal adaptation to a traumatic circumstance or experience. So this is something that we have to understand. When we look at mental illness, we assume that mental illness is something in the mind that is not working the way that it's supposed to. It's a pathology. So if you look at like autoimmune illness, okay? So this is when our immune system attacks us. That is not what the immune system was designed for. The immune system was designed to attack things that are not us, okay? So this is what we call a pathology. It's a part of my body that is malfunctioning. When we look at something like, let's say, bipolar disorder, we're not, and if we look at a manic episode in bipolar disorder or psychosis, right? So in a manic episode, we don't sleep and we hallucinate. So the brain is not supposed to not sleep. It's a normal thing to sleep every day. It is also a normal thing for the things you see to actually be there, right? Like our eyes are supposed to perceive things that are there, not things that are made up. So in this way, bipolar disorder is a pathology. It is a malfunction of the brain. But trauma is different. Trauma is not a malfunction. It is an adaptation to a circumstance. Okay? So this is part of the other reason why it's so common and why it can masquerade as so many different things. Because really what trauma is our brain's attempt, or our whole body's being's attempt to deal with crappy circumstances. It's a survival mechanism, right? It's an adaptation. This is something that really needs to be understood. So if you have some kind of trauma and you're kind of screwed up as a result, you're not actually screwed up. And this is why I think there's a lot of hope for people with trauma. Even though their problems seem really, really insurmountable, it's actually very surmountable because there's not actually anything busted with you. It's just your body or brain's attempt to adapt to a bad circumstance. Okay, so the circuitry actually works, and we'll get into that. All right. Now, we good on there? Y'all understand? Okay, so moving on. Let's start with, okay, so Dr. K, if this is a normal adaptation to circumstances, right? So like it's an adaptation to bad circumstances. We have to start, this is what I kind of love about, not a trauma, but this is what I love is someone who tries to understand the human mind. Trauma is also the thing that teaches us the most about the normal functioning of mind, because something isn't busted. It's a car that's just driving in the wrong direction, but the car is driving so you can see how everything fits together. So let's start by digging into what is like the mechanism through which the mind adapts to stuff, okay? This is where I'm going to draw a little bit on Eastern psychology because I think they explain it really, really well. So as we go through life, we have experiences, okay? So something happens out there. And if, let's say I'm at the playground and someone throws a ball at the back of my head and it hits me in the back of the head. So there's some kind of sensory experiences that happen. There are emotions that come with that sensory experience, because what is an emotion? An emotion is a very, very rapid way to present information to my mind. So I don't have time for analysis. So instead, what my mind is going to do is it's going to make me feel angry. And anger is a way that I know how to respond rapidly in a situation. Does that kind of make sense? So anger is like when we don't have time to sit down and think about what's going on, our body has these scripts that it's like, okay, activate anger. Now that we're activating anger, like I know how to respond immediately within the situation. So anytime there are experiences, there are emotions that come with those experiences. Then what happens is those emotions either get processed and digested properly or they don't. And if they don't get processed and digested properly, they sink into us. They enter into our subconscious, let's say simply. Not really precisely correct, but let's just say that. Then what happens if we face that circumstance again, like we see the kid who threw the ball, then those emotions arise back up. Okay? So they come back up. And now all that has to happen is I have to see the kid and I feel pissed off, even though nothing has happened. Does that make sense? So our mind stores that emotion, recognizes some kind of pattern, the emotions arise again, and this is a trigger. Okay? Now, there are a couple of other things that happen. When we have these kinds of experiences over and over and over again, the emotions start to form into other stuff. So if it happens once, maybe I'll get a little bit pissed. But if it happens over and over and over again, the anger starts to build up, the shame starts to build up, the fear starts to build up. And now all I have to do is walk onto the playground for recess for me to be hyper vigilant and fearful. And this is not a malfunction of the brain. This is an adaptive response of the brain. So let's say that I'm in an impala living out in the African Serengeti, and there's a watering hole with crocodiles in it. If I walk up to the watering hole and I start drinking water and a crocodile jumps out at me, I jump back. It is adaptive and normal and healthy for me to be afraid and on edge when I go back to the watering hole next time. Because, hey, this is dangerous. Y'all get that? This is exactly what happens to a child. This is not a malfunctioning mind. This is the mind functioning the way that it's supposed to. Now, over time, and we'll get more into this, this will start to change the way that we live and change the way that we think about ourselves. So when human beings start to have experiences that rack up over and over and over again, let's say that one kid threw a ball at me and a bunch of kids laughed. And now there's a second kid who is low on the social totem pole. So this kid figures out, oh, hey, if I make fun of Dr. K, I can make everyone laugh and then people will like me too. And then he picks on me. And then a third kid picks on me. And as multiple kids start picking on me, I take, and this is what the brain is supposed to do, mind is supposed to do, I take these individual, isolated, emotional experiences and I turn them into an identity. I'm low on the social totem pole. Kids don't like me. This is a conclusion that the mind comes to. Rational conclusion, not irrational conclusion. There are now 3 kids picking on you. You become the butt of the joke. Now that I have an identity, I carry the identity forward with me. People don't like me. I'm low on the social totem pole. And so this is the real problem with trauma is we carry these learnings with us. And that too is adaptive. So if I'm an impala in Africa and I drink from one watering hole and one crocodile jumps out, I go back, I drink from the same watering hole again, a second crocodile jumps out. Third time I go to the same watering hole, third crocodile jumps out. Oh, wow. This is dangerous. If I go to a new watering hole, it's adaptive to be worried about crocodiles at the next watering hole, right? Because the impala or the gazelle or whatever that doesn't carry it with it gets eaten. And so we carry it forward with us. And then it becomes a part of our identity and it informs the way that we live our life. Now, when I go to college and no one's bullying me, I still feel worse than everyone else. And then when it comes time to group project, oh my God, I'm worse than everyone else. No one will want to be with me. I'm going to sit there and I'm going to look like this. And I'm going to be like on my phone. And then everyone is meeting up for group projects and everyone's like, okay, that person seems like busy, so I'm not going to ask them, which then further reinforces my belief. And then I'm left without any partners, which further reinforces my belief. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Oh, by the way, see, the identity that I had is correct. With me? Okay. So, now, trauma is essentially learning. That's really what it is. It's learning. Okay? Now, as we go into the science of trauma, what we kind of discover is that there are 5 major domains that trauma affects within a person. Okay? The first thing it affects is our affect, which means our emotions. So it changes the way that we relate to our emotions. And specifically, it does a lot of stuff with anger and also self-destructive behavior. You may wonder, wait, what does that have to do with emotions? So if you think about like a lot of the self-destructive behaviors we engage in, everything from cutting or self-harm to even things like addictive or shooting ourselves in the foot or procrastination, all has to do with affect dysregulation. Trauma dysregulates the way that we manage our emotions. Second thing that affects is our sense, our consciousness and attention. So what do I mean by consciousness? We're not talking about thoughts, we're talking about the level of consciousness. So our ability to focus, our ability to go to sleep or be mentally checked in, right? So we'll start to check out mentally. This isn't a specific thought or emotion. Does that make sense? It's not like I'm thinking something, it's that my mind cannot focus. So I'm not like all there. It's sort of like the opposite of the flow state. Third domain that it affects is self-perception or identity. As we go through traumatic experiences, and we'll go into all this detail, okay? It changes the way that we view ourselves. Fourth thing it affects is relationships. And why is this? The reason it affects relationships is because trauma is almost always inflicted by another human being. And so when other human beings inflict trauma on us, it changes the way that we view relationships, okay? And so we carry certain important learnings, like watering whole crocodile. We start to be scared of any body of water, okay? The fifth thing that it affects is our somatic self. So what we sort of know is that there's tons of research that starts with even Freud, who noticed that people who have traumatic upbringings have changes to their body, and they have lots of somatic complaints. Okay, so these are the 5 domains that trauma affects. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about 2 major principles of trauma. Okay, and once we understand these principles, a lot of the problems that we discussed earlier, I guess it's gone. A lot of these problems will become clear. Okay, so if we want to understand these problems, we have to understand a couple of fundamentals first. So let's look at a couple of fundamentals of trauma. Okay, so what does it take for something to be traumatic? The most important element is coercive control, an environment of coercive control. Now, this is what's kind of confusing for people because people think, okay, hold on a second. So isn't sexual assault traumatic? And the answer is, it can be. And then some people may say, but hold on, what about things like genocide? Isn't genocide traumatic? And this is where, like, literally, according to the data, the answer is that it can be. So if you look at a population that is affected by like a genocidal war, right, and hopefully some of them escape, which is why they're still alive, what we discover is not everyone develops PTSD. Not everyone who's in a prisoner of war camp experiences PTSD. Not everyone who is sexually assaulted experiences PTSD. So what trauma researchers have sort of figured out is that a key aspect is coercive control. And what does that mean? That means that you grow up in an environment where someone is coercing you and controlling you. So in POWs, this kind of makes sense because we've got people like prison guards. So what happens when we grow up with an environment of coercive control? Let's say there's a prison guard. Okay? And then the prison guard does something mean to me. And then I have some kind of emotion. And then I get angry. And if I act on that anger and I yell at the prison guard, what happens? The prison guard punishes me further. So what does the mind learn? Anger is dangerous. Okay? Now let's look at another example. But what if I wasn't in prison? Let's say I have a parent. And the parent does something unfair. And then I get pissed. And then I yell at my parent. And then they punish me. Right? So think about that. What do we conclude? Anger is dangerous. So one of the key elements of coercive control is that our thoughts or emotions can actually jeopardize our survival. They can hurt us. And so when we sort of discover this, what do we do? What does the mind do? Suppresses the anger. Okay? Suppresses the anger. And now, this is where, now this suppression of anger is a spectrum. So at the one end of the spectrum, it's just suppression. Okay? We can also distraction. But if we go all the way to the extreme end of the spectrum, we end up with dissociation. Right? Does that kind of make sense? So if I've concluded that anger is dangerous, what I'm going to do is suppress it. Anytime I feel angry, it hurts my chances of survival to express or even feel the anger. Because if I feel the anger, I could lose control. So my brain is going to shut it down. When that shutting it down becomes very, very extreme, we end up with dissociation. So even suppression or distraction and dissociation are on the same spectrum, same mechanism. It's just the degree of severity. So in the cases of very severe trauma, we manifest with dissociation. In the cases of mild trauma that is maybe even not diagnosable or subclinical or me and you, we all suppress anger. Okay? Now, there are a couple of other things that are important here. So, when we start to, let's understand this neuroscientific mechanism of this dissociation, because this is going to become important later. So how does dissociation happen in the brain? So here's me, okay? And here's my brain, right hemisphere, left hemisphere. There's this thing here called the corpus callosum. So the right hemisphere is where we experience predominantly emotions, creativity, and the left hemisphere is where we experience analysis, planning, right? It's our analytical reasoning area of the brain. It's also where we do language. Brilliant trauma researcher, Van der Kolk, did a really interesting study where he looked at people who had trauma and were dissociating. And what he discovered was something called hemispheric lateralization. And what he discovered was in people with trauma, when we suppress or dissociate, we knock this out. And so what happens is, if we think about dissociation, my actions, because those come from my left hemisphere, and my feelings, which come from the right hemisphere, are separated. Right? Does that make sense? Very simple. Very, very simple. There's literally hemispheric lateralization. So in a healthy brain, when I experience something emotional, there's talk that happens between these two things. And in a brain of someone who has trauma, this thing is shut off. And so our emotions become separate from the rest of our lives. And essentially, as a human being, what trauma does to us is fragments us. Right? And then when we start to get fragmentation, we start to see all these random problems in different parts of us because we're not able to integrate it into something. And even if you look at research on post-traumatic growth, because sometimes when people are in traumatic situations, they don't get worse, they get better. They go into Chad mode and become superhuman. And what correlates with post-traumatic growth? Integration of the self. Okay? So, this will become important later. All right? So that's one aspect of coercive control. Now, let's talk a little bit about the second aspect of coercive control. Let me see if I've just got... Let me see how I want to do this. Give me a second, chat. Okay, so let's talk about a second aspect. I think I'm going to call an audible here. So, there's another aspect of coercive control. Uno momento, chat. Do I want to talk about this now? Okay. Can we heal this? Absolutely, 100%. All right, let's talk about a second aspect of coercive control, okay? Now we're going to dive into a little bit about the paralysis of initiation. And we're going to touch on this in a couple of ways. So, when we are in a coercive control environment, it does us no good to think about the future. So if I'm in a prisoner of war camp, I can't think about the future. It does me no good. Like, I can't plan for anything tomorrow. I can't invest in anything tomorrow because fundamentally, I'm not in control of my life. What happens in my life is someone else's decision, and there's a lack of autonomy. And if there's a lack of autonomy, there's no point in thinking about the future. And so we sort of know this in prisoners of war, but this is also important for kids. Because if I don't have any agency, what is the value of thinking about the future? What good does it do me to plan for what I want to do this weekend if my parents never let me choose what I do this weekend? My parents are like, yeah, we're not going to let you go over to your friend's house. We're just going to do this particular thing. You're going to stay home. You're going to help me with this. We're going to go to church. We're going to go to temple, whatever. You don't get a choice. So the other thing that we tend to see when there are environments of coercive control is if there is no autonomy, and we'll get more into this in a second, there's no point to thinking about the future. And not only is there no point to thinking about the future, it is actually harmful to think about the future. Because if I get my hopes up and I want to go to a friend's house and my parents cancel it at the last minute, then I'm disappointed and sad. And my friend is upset because I flaked. So how does the brain adapt? Don't think of the future. And this has actually been shown to be relevant for people with trauma, where we'll get more into this in a second. But basically what happens is, like, we learn adaptively to stop planning ahead, because our brain tells us every time you plan ahead, it's just a mess. We're going to shut this circuit off in the brain. Okay? And what this results in is this thing called the paralysis of initiation, where people can't get started because there's no point. Right? And we carry that learning with us, which is exactly what our mind is supposed to do. So let's talk a little bit about this destruction of autonomy and coercive control, because now we're going to talk a little bit about relationships. Now, if I grow up in an environment of coercive control, or I'm placed in an environment of coercive control, that changes the way that I think about myself and changes the way that I think about other people. So here are a couple of features, right? So let's do another diagnostic test, chat. There's a fear of unpredictability. This is what people look for in trauma. They grow up in environments with the following characteristics: trivial demands, petty rules, and small indulgences. So if this sounds like your household, this could be an issue for you. Now let's understand this. Why does this happen? Okay? I'm going to try to explain this. So, when you have an abuser, their goal is to control you. So what people sort of figure out is, and this is what's really interesting, you can look at trauma research, and what you actually figure out is when researchers look at, like, guards from concentration camps and abusive parents, what they figure out is everyone uses the same techniques. And so human beings intrinsically know how to control other human beings. It doesn't have to be taught. It's discovered. So here's kind of what happens in the mind of an abuser. what they want to try to do is destroy your autonomy. And so the way that they destroy your autonomy is by imposing certain kinds of limits. But this is what's really important. So it makes some sort of petty or arbitrary rule. The rule doesn't have like much function, right? It doesn't really matter if I put my jacket away or put my shoes away. But the abuser is like, you do it in this order because I told you so. And so what they're doing in that moment is destroying your autonomy. And in order for human beings to be okay with someone destroying their autonomy, the person who is destroying your autonomy has to give you small indulgences. Okay? This is key. Key part of traumatic people, abusers, is that what they want to do is if they treat you unfairly all the time, then you're going to mentally check out because there's like this person is unreasonable. They're like the weather. There is nothing I can do to control them. But the moment the person starts doing nice stuff to you, now suddenly you know, okay, I can get the nasty parent or I can get the good parent. And so the way that they chip away at your autonomy is by actually creating an environment where the person who is traumatized feels like they're in control by like not pissing this other person off. So they know that this person is capable of kindness. And so if I behave properly, then this person will be nice to me. And what this sort of does is it engenders a dependence on the abuser for all things good and all things bad, right? Because that's the only way it's going to happen. So I become dependent on this person because this is the person that brings me the treats and this is the person that brings me the punishment. But if I ever get the treats from one person and the punishment from another person, then I'm going to become independent because I'm going to say, F this person. So in the abusive relationship, what they actually do is they're very careful. We sort of see this. We'll call it love bombing, right? Like this person is nasty to me and then they love bomb me. And people get confused, like, why can't this person leave the abusive relationship? It's because what happens in the mind of the abused person is that this abuser becomes God. This is the bestower of health and happiness. This is the bestower of being able to go to bed at night without bruises on my body. And this is the bestower of chocolate cake. And so when this happens, and this is what people will intentionally do, they'll create petty rules, right? Things that are not justifiable. And they become whimsical. And there's a lot of unpredictability. Because if there's unpredictability, then the person kind of like engages in the behavior. We sort of see this with loot boxes, where when there's a random reinforcement schedule, we play the game over and over and over again. And so if I know that sometimes if I behave myself, if I get a chocolate cake, I'm going to keep playing the game over and over and over again. Traumatic abusers were the original loot box. Loot box 1.0. Okay? And so over time, what this person will do is engender dependence on the person who has been traumatized. As we become dependent on the abuser, a couple of things start to happen. The first is that independent action becomes insubordination. And when independent action becomes insubordination, what does that do to your sense of autonomy? Destroys it. If your sense of autonomy is destroyed, how can you initiate actions? You can't, because you were taught that independent action is insubordination. Second thing is that in traumatic relationships, there is no room for trial and error. Right? Because if I talk back, I'm going to get beat. I can't test boundaries. It's about survival. No impala or gazelle goes up to the edge of the water and debates the crocodile. It's insane. We debate people in places like video games where there's no real consequence. We do not debate crocodiles. Debate crocodiles. We also don't debate crocodiles, but, you know. So now we begin to see a couple of different things. So if I have no room for trial and error, how can I try something? Right? So this is where we see another aspect of the paralysis of initiation for people who are traumatized, which is that if I have learned that trial and error is absolutely a mistake, I can't try anything. What that means, if I can't try anything, it has to be a perfect success. And until I can get it to a perfect success, I cannot start. So if you are someone who looks for perfection before you get started, could be a trauma response. You'll get that? Because your caregivers have punished you for trial and error. What they expect from you is obedience. Don't try stuff. How dare you? So as we grow up in this relationship, it alters our worldview. The world becomes a place where I cannot experiment. It alters our sense of self. My success or happiness is not dependent on me or my actions. It is dependent on someone else. Okay? And this is like the key thing to understand about this is like, I want y'all to think about if things in your life, being good or bad, are fundamentally dependent on someone else, what do you think that does to your capacity to initiate and fix your problems? Completely destroys it. Because whether I'm happy or not, whether I'm successful or not, depends on someone else. The whole point of the traumatic relationship is that independence is insubordination, so it gets quashed out of you. Do y'all get that? And so the thing is, you carry that fucking belief with you. And so when people look at you and they say, why don't you fix your problems? It's because for 15 years of your life, you've been taught that fixing your problems is the biggest damn mistake you can make. I will tell you what you should fix. How dare you try to fix your own problems? And if you look at these traumatic relationships, independence, oh, good God, there is no greater sin than fixing your problems without God. How dare you do anything without me? And then we wonder, why can't I do things for myself? Because these are the laws of the world that you discovered. So I want you all to think about it this way. If I take a kid and I stick him on the moon, the whole body and the mind and the brain will develop on moon gravity. These are the laws of the universe. This is the force of gravitation. In that same way, there is a force of independence, Fi. There's a force of autonomy. And if you grow up in a traumatic household, the rules of the game that you grew up playing are different. It's like you're playing life with a mod. And that's the way you learn the game. And then you go back to playing the base game, and all of your muscle memory is based on this mod. And so it's hard to play the game the way that it's supposed to be played. Okay? All right. Let's take a quick second for questions, and then we're going to move on to specific problems. Any questions so far? We'll get to the natural history, how to uninstall the mod pack. That's what's coming next. Another word for insubordination, independence. Right? Okay. What if your abusers were also abused? Makes no difference. They probably were abused. That's how they learned how to do it. Makes no difference. Right? Because your brain is still wired the way it is. What happens if your abuser dies? So remember, a key part of this trauma is that you carry it with you. How to tell the difference between paralysis of initiation and procrastination? They're the same thing. They could be the same thing, right? That's the whole point. We'll get to more in detail in a second. What therapy options for C-PTSD? We'll get to all that. Okay, so I'm seeing lots of questions that we're going to answer later, so we're going to keep going. All right, so now let's look at a particular manifestation of this. Okay, and we probably got a standalone YouTube video coming out around this. So let's talk a little bit about identity and life on autopilot. So let's talk about how, so if we go up here, remember that it affects our self-perception and identity, so we're going to dive into that, okay? All right. So when you look at research on trauma, this is devastating, y'all. This is heartbreaking. So when you look at research on trauma, what you discover is that people who are traumatized, like later in life, okay? So like prisoners of war, people who were sexually assaulted. They say after they're sexually assaulted, I'm not myself. I don't feel like myself because of dissociation and whatever. But here's the question. You can say I'm not myself if there was an isolated traumatic experience because you grew up and you developed an identity. This is who I am. Then something happens to you and you're like, I am not that person anymore. Tragic, absolutely. Difficult, absolutely. What happens if the trauma precedes the formation of self? What happens if you never had a chance to develop an identity? Or what kind of identity do you develop if the trauma is there when you are developing your sense of identity? Y'all get that? So what we see in these relationships is a disordered sense of identity that is based on other people. Okay? So here's what happens to our sense of identity. There are all kinds of things. The first is that identity is based, period. Identity, oh. Wait, has this been happening this whole time? Or is it just now? Okay, saved, okay. Echo is based. So identity is based in others. So this is how we become people pleasers, right? And hopefully this kind of makes sense. So this is what I'm trying to do. If y'all like got this business over here, you can understand how your identity is based in others, right? We don't need to explain it more. So we accommodate other people because remember that our happiness or our success is based on others. So there is another aspect of identity with trauma, which is that our identity becomes fragmented. Now, why does it become fragmented? So remember our brain. So what is our identity based on? So remember when we talked about how trauma is not a pathology. So what's normally happens? So I have an experience, I have emotions, those experiences pile up, the emotions pile up, I process them, I integrate them, and I form some kind of identity of myself. So what we sort of know is that identity is based on integration. Right? So like when my thoughts and my emotions and my relationships, when all these things combine, like this is who I am. Who I am is a summation of how people treat me, what I think, how I behave, how I feel. We put all this stuff together, and this is who I am. This is why we cannot define who I am based on just one thing. So are you your emotions? No. Are you your thoughts? No. Are you your body? No. Are you your experiences? No. What you are is a summation of all of these things. What does trauma do? Trauma fragments the brain, literally, right? So we've got our emotional circuitry over here. We've got Broca's area over here. Broca's area is where we get our capacity for language. And so when our emotions are over here and we have hemispheric lateralization, I cannot describe my emotions. So if you ask someone who's dissociating, what are you feeling? They will say, I don't know, or I am not feeling anything. They are not aware of it, or they can't articulate it. So identity requires integration of the self. Integration of all of your different experiences. Narrative, right? This is who I am, and then I did this, and then these emotions happened here, and then I started thinking this way, and then I behaved this way, and this is who I became as a result of that. Trauma fundamentally fractures the brain, and if it fractures the brain, we cannot form a sense of identity. Okay? Now, there are a couple of other things involved here. So what our brain learns is that oftentimes people who have trauma, how can I say this? If we kind of go back to this stuff, remember that anger is dangerous and anger has to be suppressed. So our brain learns this thing. If I feel emotion, I need to shut off. We're going to shut this off. No emotion. If I have no emotion, I can't make sense of things. And remember, the frontal lobes are here too. Planning, action, direction. So if this thing is shut off and all these parts are separated, I can't do anything, right? So this is behavioral paralysis. And then we get to, who am I? I don't know. Now, what does this have to do with how you live your life, right? Because if we go back to this, a lack of unifying direction. All right, so this is going to be really simple. How are you supposed to have any kind of unifying direction if there isn't a you? If I ask you the question, what is your unifying direction? This question only makes sense with a you. If you take the you out of the equation, what is unifying direction? I don't know. It's, I guess, an average of what everyone else is doing. How are you supposed to find direct? I guess I'll kind of do. And then, if you kind of think about that, like that's how half of the world lives their lives. I'm just going to average what everyone else is doing, and I'll kind of try to do that half-heartedly because there's no me in it. I don't actually want it. And so we live our life based on autopilot. We live because we have no sense of identity. What do you want from life? If you want to know what you want from life, you have to start with who you are. And if you don't have you, then we end up living a life that is reactive. And now this is where we go back to this idea of coercive control. So think about it this way. Okay? If I can't plan for the future and I don't know who I am, how do I learn to live life? I learn to live life responsively. Not responsibly, responsively. So what am I going to do today? Depends how mommy and daddy are feeling. What am I going to do today? Depends on how the guards are feeling. And so what we end up doing is living a very reactive life. We're like an NPC. I'm going to just sit here until someone walks up to me and initiates dialogue. Right? That's how we live our lives. If there's a test tomorrow, I will study. There's a Spanish test tomorrow, so I will study Spanish. But I can't study Spanish for the sake of learning. Like, that becomes impossible. Right? Does that make sense? You have to have a you. And there's a fragmentation of identity when we grow up in these kinds of ways because our sense of identity is in relation to this other person, this giver of pain and pleasure. of joy and direction. And then we don't know who we are. And so all we can do is kind of like autopilot based on the average. It's like Twitch chat plays Pokemon. Which way are we going to go? It kind of depends on what our inputs are in the moment. And if that's the way you're living your life, you can't have a direction. And Twitch can play Pokemon because all of y'all can unify yourselves towards a particular goal, because everyone in Twitch chat is looking out for the streamer. That's not how the way the real world works. It's not like every person, Joe, Dick, and Harry, and Jane that you meet out there is cooperating to try to get your goal done. Do you see that? So what people with trauma end up doing is living life on autopilot, and it's just like if someone walks up to you and aggroes you, then you'll fight. And if someone walks up to you and initiates dialogue, then you'll date. But then we run into a problem because you get bodied. You know why you get bodied? Because you're not leveling up when the person who's initiating combat with you is out there living their life, and they're leveling up because they're initiating combat with people. So they're level 10 and you're level 1. And then you get bodied. And then it's GG. You can't ask anyone out on a date. One time you have some magical stars aligned relationship and you don't know how to behave in a relationship. And then you GG out after some time because you don't know how to behave in a relationship. And then you wait on the corner for someone else to walk up and initiate dating with you. With me? Okay. So if there isn't a you, there's not going to be a direction. All right, let's keep going. Next problem. Okay. Next thing we're going to... Oh, whoops. Wait, what? Wait, every time... Why is this thing... Something is not saving chat. Oh, no. Okay. It looks like this. Okay, so this is the one. No, wait, hold on. Okay, we're going to just... hold on. I don't know why this isn't saving. Give me a second, chat. Okay. Are we good now? Okay. Let's move on. So now we're going to move on to why people with trauma can't fix their problems. Y'all ready for this? So sometimes we see someone who is in an abusive relationship and they're like, why don't you just break up? Right? Can't fix your problems. And then what happens is there's a whole other crop of us who can't fix our problems, but we don't think it's trauma. We think it's like, I suck at life. That's my problem, is I'm bad at the game of life. So let's understand this. This goes back to the fundamental of coercive control, okay? So I'm going to ask y'all a couple of questions. And I'm also going to ruin, oh God, I'm going to ruin everything with the overlays. Okay. So, if I grow up in an environment of coercive control, and there is a problem, let's say that I have a parent who's emotionally abusive, I can't get them to stop yelling at me because I have no control in the situation. So when there is a problem, what is the way that I deal with that pain? So what we discover in research on people who've been traumatized is they have emotion-focused coping. Okay? And what that sort of means is that I can't... So if I'm hurt... So let me just think about how to say this. So if I'm hurt, I focus on fixing my emotions because I can't control anything outside of me. So I can't stop my parents from being abusive. I can't stop the guards from hitting me. All I can do is focus on my internal emotional state because I fundamentally do not have control around me. So then my brain learns when I am suffering, don't change anything out there because changing stuff out there is futile. What I need to fix is in here. So I'm going to do what? I'm going to dissociate. Or I'm going to use drugs, right? So there's very high correlation between substance use and people who have been traumatized. Because fundamentally, the way that you learn how to fix problems is within, because I can't control anything outside. Then you carry that learning with you. So now when my professor says, hey, your paper was due today and I did not receive a paper. So I have to dock you 10 points, but give it to me by the end of the weekend and you could still get a B. This is a problem. And how do we deal with problems? We deal with them using emotionally focused coping. So how do I fix this problem? I get smashed. Because this hurts. And what do I do when things hurt on the outside? Hurt on the inside. Can I fix things on the outside? No. I cannot fix them on the outside, so I have to fix it on the inside. So what we see in people with trauma is, Jesus, why does this keep going back to this? What is going on here? I guess I will do emotionally focused coping. Hold on. Why isn't this ever saving? Okay. So, what we're going to do is we're not going to actually fix problems. We're going to do emotionally focused coping. Okay? So when I have problems are fixed by fixing emotions. And in order to fix our emotions, we're going to do stuff like get addicted to substances. And now we begin to see like why this sort of becomes an addiction, because instead of fixing the problem itself, all I know how to do is use substances to fix the emotions because that's the strategy that worked. And if I'm fixing the emotions and that's the strategy that worked, and I'm getting drunk, let's say, or smashed, then Monday rolls around, my paper is even later, and now I get a C. And now I get a C, what am I going to do? I'm going to drink more. And so it becomes a cycle of increasing problems, followed by worsening emotions, followed by increased problematic behaviors. Okay? Make sense? That's problem number 2. Why people with trauma can't fix their problems. Okay. Problem number 3. Inability to concentrate. So, let's understand this. How does the mind concentrate the best? It enters a flow state, right? We sort of know this. There's the science of optimal performance. If we can enter a flow state, then I can concentrate perfectly. What does a flow state require? Studies on this. Flow states have a synchronous activity across the brain. In essence, it is the opposite of this. So when we fracture our brain, right? So if we kind of think about flow state in the science of things like eustress, you want to be excited, you want to be focused. Like sometimes like when I work with esports professionals, there's a certain amount of like emotional activation that brings out the best performance. If you're too angry, you're going to tilt. But if you're too relaxed, you're not going to play your best game. So we sort of know that there is this curve of eustress. If your stress is up here, you're overwhelmed. If your stress is down here, you're bored. So this is stress. This is performance. And this is the optimal level of performance in eustress. So we need to be like excited enough. Let's go. Let's do it. Hype. Now, what happens in trauma? So we have a fragmented mind, right? Which is, remember, what the mind tried to do, because it was like, hey, in order to protect us from our emotions, we got to split everything apart so that one cannot hurt the other. It's like a quarantine of different parts of your mind, which is literally what dissociation is. Quarantining a portion of your mind. So then what happens is we attempt a task. Right? Because we got to do stuff. Chat? And then what happens is we don't finish. And then what happens is tasks pile up. And then what happens is we get overwhelmed. And by the way, when we get overwhelmed, what do? Do we fix the problem, chat? Remind me? Now we're emotional. Enter addiction. Overwhelmed. Emotion-focused coping. Maladaptive behavior. Gaming, online shopping, porn, drugs, whatever. Okay? Now, as this happens, this all gets harder, right? So now we're going to multiply all this stuff by 2. And then what happens? We do a couple rounds of the rodeo, and you remember at the very beginning when we talked about, okay, how does the mind work? We end up with a conclusion about ourselves. I suck. This looks like chronic depression. Changes our belief in the self. Right? Make sense? Clicking? This is where chronic depression comes from. Because now you have a belief about yourself. And this is why people with trauma have difficulty concentrating. They have a fragmented mind. Things start to build up. They start to feel overwhelmed. It further fragments their mind. It makes it harder for them to concentrate. The harder it is to concentrate, you attempt a task, it's hard to complete. And then as this happens a lot, you develop an identity of yourself. As you develop an identity of yourself, that informs the way that you then interact with the world. If I suck, I'm not going to try. If I'm not going to try, I'm going to start becoming an autopilot NPC. I'm not going to initiate any action. It all comes together. Right? So this is kind of like, and hopefully at this point, y'all understand trauma. Because this is it. In a nutshell, all of these things put together. So this is what's bizarre, is there's so many different things going on. There's relationships, there's identity, there's even the inability to concentrate, there is emotional suppression, there is inability to think about the future, there is living life reactively, there is focus on emotional coping instead of actually fixing your problems. All of this is related to trauma. And it manifests as so many different things. So many different things, right? Our big list of chronic depression. I can't stop watching porn. I'm living my life like an NPC. If someone comes up to me and initiates, I can do stuff. But I can't have direction. What do you want? I want an amalgamation of what other people want. No, what do you want? I don't know what I want. Why don't you know what I want? I don't know who I am. Why don't you know who you are? Well, because my brain, when I was growing up, adaptively fractured different parts, created problems like hemispheric lateralization, and we're not even touching on things like cortisol and all this kind of crap. And since I dissociate from my emotions and I have no upward momentum in life, all of this negative energy and anger is going to start manifesting in weird ways in my body, like diarrhea and rashes. Because where else is it supposed to go? And I was taught at a very young age that anger cannot be sent outward. We didn't even touch on this, but man, there's so many iterations of this. Being angry is dangerous for my survival. So where does all that anger go? Either causes rashes, or where's the one safe place that I can put my anger? Because I suck. I'm pathetic. And now we understand where self-hatred comes from. Because it's all my fault. Because God is divine and I am broken. I can get angry with myself. And so then we talk about depression. How do you feel about myself? I have low self-esteem. I'm worthless. I'm hopeless. That's not low self-esteem. It's self-hatred. Very different. Maybe exactly the same. Who knows? Okay? Now, asking the important questions. Can you change? Answer is absolutely. Oh, hey, it's working this time. Cool. So how do you change? So, trauma research shows a couple things. Remember that our brain is fragmented, but it isn't broken. So I've had a ton of very positive experiences as a psychiatrist in helping people with trauma. People think that things like borderline personality disorder or narcissism are permanent because this is the way I was wired, right? Thankfully, not correct. You can put all these pieces together. You can absolutely wind up here, like this again. Absolutely. And the data even supports this. 91% of people who have borderline personality disorder will be in remission at the 10-year mark. The natural history of the human body and mind is to heal. That is the natural history of the human body and mind. That's what's super cool about it. Don't give up hope. Because remember, you're not actually broken. Nothing is, it's pathology, but it's not a malfunction of some fundamental circuit, right? It's not like you've got like a lysosomal storage disease where there's some like neurotransmitter or some receptor that's just coded incorrectly and you're like SOL. Not like that at all. We just have to put the pieces back together. How do we do that? Number one, safety and stabilization. We didn't really get into this, but all the crap that we talked about is like high cortisol, high stress, high emotion leads to dissociation, leads to fragmented identity. Right? So the first thing you've got to do is be safe. Most important thing. Very hard to heal trauma if you are actively getting traumatized. A simple way to put it is you can't learn how to swim if you're drowning. The right way to learn how to swim is get out of the water, catch your breath, and then go in slowly. So this is where I hate to say this. And I wish that we lived in a world where you could just listen to this lecture, wake up tomorrow, and by force of will, fix yourself. But it starts by fixing your environment. Now, what does fixing your environment look like? Thankfully, so I would say strive for independence or limitations around the toxic people. So this is where you don't have to fix everything. Watch out for your mind. That's like what it does with that, right? So look at the reactions of your mind. Sometimes it's as simple as seeing a therapist for 1 hour a week. That can be enough of a platform for you to rest on and start to branch out in the rest of your life. But safety and stabilization is the most important thing. Okay? So if you want to see a therapist, go for it. It can be friends, it can be family, it can be moving out of your house. So if you're in a toxic environment, I would say very practically the most important thing is to try to get out of the house. And this is where you can say, but I can't get out of the house for these reasons. But you've got to be super careful because there may actually be solutions there, but your mind isn't able to find them. And that's why, honestly, sometimes you just need help. So ask for help. There's more, though. Okay? The second thing is we need to deal with anxiety and emotional coping. The foundation of a lot of this stuff is the disintegration of our emotions. That doesn't mean the absence of emotions. That means literally the disintegration. So this is why things like DBT or dialectical behavioral therapy are so effective. We also have things like EMDR, works somewhat differently. These are two evidence-based treatments. But we also know that things like meditation, exercise, etc., can all work for this kind of stuff. Very practically, what this means is that if you are experiencing some kind of negative emotion, the most important thing to do is don't go towards the emotional coping mechanism. Okay, so here's what happens. When I have negative emotion, there's emotional coping, which reduces negative emotion. And now what I've done is I've taken that right hemisphere and I've shut it off. But the whole point is we need that emotion. We literally need the emotion. It's a part of the integration. So we've got to stop doing this. Now, this is what's super cool. When we do something like psychotherapy, what we do is we help this person take that emotion, go over to Broca's area, and put it into language. Now, if I'm about to say something that I do not expect many of y'all to believe, but it is true. Language can substitute for action. Biggest misunderstanding in society today is that if you have a problem, you have to fix the problem. Literally, Freud came up with this concept and it has been tested. Language can substitute for action. 100%. We see it time and time again in our coaching program. We see it in psychotherapy. A lot of people don't sign up for this stuff because they're like, I don't understand how talking about it makes any difference. The problem still exists. And literally what I hope I have done at this point is when you articulate, there is integration. When there is integration, there is flow state. And when there is flow state, there is improvement. Because here's the problem. So here's the other thing to remember. The frontal lobes are here too. These are the parts of your brain that plan and execute tasks. But as long as this corpus callosum is severed, that emotion you cannot use to fuel you. So literally, this is what we've seen. There are people who have been traumatized and they will go to psychotherapy. We will teach them how to integrate their emotions and they turn their life around. You know how to find a job. You know how to build a resume. You know how to Google that crap. You know how to ask GPT to do it for you. The problem is not in not knowing how to do it. The problem is that your fucking brain doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Why does your brain not do what it's supposed to do? Because it's split into a million pieces. It's not a brain. It is 1,000 different fragments that are all dissociated from each other and can't actually do anything. Language is a substitute for action. Crazy, but true. And we kind of know this, right? So there's like stuff about cognitive dissonance, just to give you all a random example. If you get someone to say that they're going to do something or believe that they're going to do something, it makes them more likely to do it. You know what I mean? So like that cognitive, like once you say something, you're like, it's hard for you to not do it. There's all kinds of connections, like literally in your fucking brain. Broca's area where we articulate things, and the frontal lobes where we plan and execute action, especially on the left side of the brain, are connected. And we sort of know that, like, if we look at things like motivational interviewing and coaching and stuff like that, our methodologies, we don't teach people anything. We just get them to articulate it. And you can't articulate something unless you understand it. Once you understand it, I'm not talking about information. I'm talking about understanding. Then you start doing it. And what do you do when you start doing it? What is the thought that you have? Oh, crap, this was actually way easier than I thought. This is the value of understanding. Understanding comes from integration. Integration comes from articulating your emotions. So articulate your emotions. The last thing, I'm going to teach you all a meditation. एक तत्व अभ्यास. एक तत्व अभ्यास is to focus on one thing at a time. That's it. What you'll need to do, so remember there's that whole concentration problem, right? Where there's lots of unfinished tasks that overwhelm us and kind of pile up. So what we're going to do really simple meditation technique. But by all means, learn grounding techniques from DBT and things like that. Those will help with emotional coping. That stuff is good too. Ek Tattva Abhyas, literally take 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day, and just do one thing. I'm not even saying make it productive. If it's hard to do productive things, you don't have to do productive things. Put this away when you eat. When you're taking a poop completely. Grab a cup of tea and drink it completely. When we do Ek Tattva Abhyas, put your full attention into the one thing. It can even be a breath. For one moment, do it with me now. Close your eyes. Feel the breath. That's it. And for a moment, think about nothing else. Chop wood, carry water. Focus on one thing at a time. That's it. And so if you look at trauma treatments, they're very, very complicated. But I hope today that if y'all have, hopefully, I don't know how to do this, but I tried to explain what trauma is. Period. I have no idea if it's even possible to reduce it to an hour. We're sitting at 1 hour and 17 minutes. But the cool thing is that y'all are not busted. It is the brain's way to adapt to your circumstances. And the thing about our brain is when we learn something today, we do not forget it tomorrow. That is not a bug, it is a feature. And so the things that we learned when we were traumatized, the whole fucking point of the brain is that we carry it forward. Once I learn the first 3 letters of the alphabet, I don't replace them with the next 3. I need to carry them forward. It ain't a bug, it's a feature. And since your learning capacity is actually intact, you can just learn a different way. So don't give up hope, because actually the majority of evidence suggests that you will get better. There are things that you can do to accelerate it. And the cool thing is that no matter which of these problems you have, and maybe the reason that you don't have a diagnosis is because you don't have all of them. Because remember, in mental illness, we need the majority of it. But what I found time and time again is whether people are like directionless in life, living life on autopilot, can't concentrate, keep on running away to emotional coping mechanisms. This is trauma is the gold mine to transform your life. Because it is the fundamental way that our brain works and the way that we interact with the world, the way we find direction, the way we execute tasks, the way we form relationships. All of it can be found in trauma, which is why it is the great chameleon, because it looks as like 1,000 different problems, but it's all one problem. And that problem has to do with the way that your brain works. And if you can conquer this one thing, and honestly, it's not that hard. You can start, it's really hard, but it's very doable. And start with simple things like don't run away from your emotions. Articulate your emotions. And this is what's so confusing. Everyone's like, what do I do? What do I do? You don't do anything. You speak. You speak. You articulate what happens to you. And we know from research of post-traumatic growth, 2 people in the same ethnicity and a different ethnicity tries to wipe out your race. One person crumbles and crashes and burns. The other person becomes superhuman. It is not the traumatic experience which determines this. It is you that determines this, how your brain responds to this. And this is empowering. You guys have to understand this. Like, literally think about this. There are studies on people who go through genocide, and some of them chad the fuck up. And now be careful, because you say, I'm not someone who's going to chad the fuck up. But pay attention to what I've been saying. That's a consequence of everything else that's happened. And you can absolutely chad the fuck up. And you don't even need to do anything. You don't have to fix all of that stuff, because your brain is not broken. You just need to get it to work the way that it's supposed to. Just integrate it and everything will start to follow. And this is what I've seen time and again with patients who are deeply traumatized. Is like at some point something clicks and they just start living their life. And if they can do it, you can do it. Good luck. Questions? Yeah, maybe you should have used fewer F-bombs. Okay. For those of y'all that are joining us late, we just explained trauma. Kind of from start to finish, but also like I left out 99.99% of it. But that's what we try to do here. And like, there's a lot of good stuff here. So much good stuff. And if you want to take away one thing from this channel, hopefully this was understandable. And since everyone's not confused, I think we did it. Like in the sense that most people are getting this. You can watch it again, but like the real tragedy of this stuff is that the reason we suffer, the Buddha says that the reason we suffer is avidya, ignorance, which really confuses a lot of people. But this is why. If you play a game and you don't understand the rules, it's going to be painful. But once you understand the rules, okay, item timings, rotations, the flow of the map, you can play the game well. And if there's one thing you want to learn about how to play the game of life well, understand trauma. So how do you integrate? So this is where I'd say the integration starts. So if we look at trauma, my understanding of it, or the best answer I can give you is that integration starts with that emotional dissociation. And like we said earlier, like it's not, you don't even have to dissociate to have that suppression. And we kind of know this, right? So we know that like so I was working with an author who had done a couple of different books that were of varying success. And they were just paralyzed. Like they had so many expectations to live up to. They had done some things that they felt were disappointing. And it was like a block. They just couldn't write. Like, I don't know how to make. Sometimes I write and it's a good book, and sometimes I write and it's a crappy book. I just can't write. Like, I don't know which one it's going to be. And how did we get them to write? We just got through their emotions. Right? And all this stuff around acceptance and stuff like that, like, yeah, I understand you feel afraid. Right? But once you like learn to accept that fear and accept that you can't create a good book, all you can do is write, then the writing starts to come. It's like breaking open a dam. And all of that creative energy that got you those first handful of books in the first place just comes roaring out. It's a breakthrough. And I think it starts with emotions, especially in our society, because we have a society that as we externalize our attention and we have all this dopaminergic crap, all of that stuff suppresses our emotional circuitry. Is there hope for someone with untreated trauma when I've lived with it for about half my life? I do want to get better, but I give up or always go back to old habits. 100% there's hope. And I'd even say that the odds are in your favor. I mean, I've seen drastic clinical improvement for people who are like 65. Like, there's absolutely hope. And this is the reason I say that is, once again, because you aren't broken. Your brain actually works perfectly. It's just doing what it knows how to do best. And it's learned this stuff from the past and is carrying it forward. All that has to happen is you have to learn a different way for a different game, because now your circumstances have changed. Now, one other thing that we can talk about real quick. This is interesting. So if we look at some of the mechanisms of action for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, right? So there are a couple of things about psychedelics. The first is that the trials that show promise are psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And so what does that do? It creates integration. Right? All of these ego-related beliefs about myself and how I'm a loser and all this stuff, that melts away. We have some weird experience with a psychedelic, and then we work with a psychotherapist to reintegrate. And this is also why psychedelics can create PTSD. So if you use it in a bad frame of mind and you have a bad trip with something like LSD, you are left fragmented because you don't know how to reintegrate. And so if we look at psychedelics, and I strongly recommend that you do not use them, and the reason why is even in all of the cases where we look at psychedelics being helpful, they are not done randomly by someone. They're done by, well, I guess that's not, all is a strong word, but generally speaking, if you look at kind of like the reliable beneficial uses of psychedelics, they are done in a very structured way, either as part of a spiritual tradition where you've got like a shaman or someone who's guiding you, or with a psychotherapist. Okay, so I got triggered by the stream. How do I calm down? You don't calm down, right? So this is really important. The tendency is to, okay, how do I make this emotion go away? And people who have been traumatized don't focus on fixing the problem. They focus on making the emotion go away. They focus on making the emotion go away because that's the only thing that they could do in the environment of coercive control. I can't control my mom or dad's actions or their abuse, but I can control the way that I feel. And so then you learn to not try to fix your problems. Right? So this is where I'd say sit with the emotion. It's okay to be triggered. Breathe. Have a cup of tea. Go for a walk. Don't engage in your default retreat mechanism and let that emotion be there. Even if we look at something like EMDR, EMDR does something really interesting. Because what they actually do is articulate the trauma. But they have this eye movement component to it that's kind of meditative. That when there is articulation of the trauma, we're doing something else, because normally when we articulate the trauma, we trigger all of our trauma responses in dissociation. But by doing that eye movement while we're literally like reading about the trauma or hearing ourselves talk about the trauma or whatever it is, we don't trigger that same pathway. So healing from trauma is all about carving out a new pathway. What if you had emotional trauma from parents and still do and DID? What you're talking about randomly, what if you had I don't understand the question. SSRIs are interesting. So our SSRI is useful for this. There is some evidence that there are serotonergic disturbances in people who have trauma-related disorders. But generally speaking, the clinical trials for SSRIs for trauma-related disorders have not been that successful. So jury's still out, is my thought. What a great question. Silverly Zero is saying, how does trauma and ADHD link? Okay, so the biggest link between ADHD and trauma is that there's a decent chance you don't even have ADHD. The biggest link is that trauma masquerades as ADHD. So as we know with people who have trauma, they have difficulty concentrating and achieving a flow state. Why do they have difficulty achieving a flow state? Well, let me rephrase that, okay? So here's what we know. Optimal concentration and focus comes from the flow state. The flow state, in turn, comes from integration of every part of your brain. In experiences like trauma, what we have is a fragmentation of functions of the brain. This literally causes things like dissociation and depersonalization. So when our brain becomes fragmented, we can't attain a flow state. If we can't attain a flow state, we have difficulties in difficulties in concentration. If we have difficulties in concentration and focus and follow through of tasks and executive dysfunction, then we get diagnosed with ADHD. So biggest link is trauma pretends to be ADHD. Thoughts on IFS therapy for trauma? I think it's cautiously optimistic. What if you have BPD and the emotion doesn't seem to go away? What a great question. So, people with BPD have a very, very high risk of becoming addicted to substances. And why is this? It's because we know that in the brains of people with BPD, they experience negative emotion more quickly, more intensely, and it lingers for a longer period of time. And so in order to cope with that emotion, we will turn to things like substances. So a huge part of BPD treatment is alternate emotional coping mechanisms. This is also the reason that BPD people engage in self-harm or eating disorder behaviors. These are all different methods to manage our emotions. So when I feel emotionally really hurt, if you really look at the nature of self-injurious behavior, it's not always or even rarely is suicidal in nature. Because if you think about why do people cut, cutting is a superficial harm to the skin. So you're not actually damaging yourself. You're cutting at the level that the nerve endings are actually the strongest. So it inflicts maximum pain with minimal damage. Why would someone want to inflict maximal pain with minimal damage? Because if I can't stop hurting up here, if I hurt over here enough, I'll stop thinking. It is actually a focusing technique. What we want to do in therapy, we don't want y'all to cut, is we want to give y'all alternatives to that. But it's essentially a very powerful meditation technique, which is harmful to do over time. So with BPD, you've experienced those emotions. Absolutely, you're right. They're more intense, they last longer, they hurt more. And so that's why DBT is something that's so revolutionary, because we figured out cognitive behavioral therapy isn't enough, and we can teach you grounding techniques that will make the emotions more manageable. As soon as you start managing the emotions, the negative behaviors start to decline. Because if I'm feeling unloved, I will go engage in all kinds of behaviors to make other people treat me in a way that makes me feel loved. But that causes more problems. Maybe I start becoming promiscuous. Maybe I start giving people gifts. Maybe I start becoming a doormat. So it's a little bit different. What if you had a traumatic past and also experience with so-called LSD? I'd say go see a therapist in either case and learn how to meditate. What about coercive control in a family business environment? I don't mean to laugh, but it's like 30% of the people that I've worked with in trauma is like your exact situation. Safety and stabilization, which oftentimes means independence. Independence oftentimes pisses the hell out of your family. So that's where you got to find a port in a storm. You have to find one safe harbor. And oftentimes that, with the people that I've worked, that's been in a clinical relationship. So you can like find a therapist, someone who you can trust, who you can vocalize all these feelings to. And as your emotions start to like become clear, and as you gain understanding and control of them, your frontal lobes will kick in and you will start to set limits. And that seems impossible now, but what makes it seem impossible? Your emotions. It feels impossible. Emotions, emotions, emotions. Because you know what to do. You know how to become independent. You know how to set limits. You may even know how to take control of the coercive family environment. I've seen that happen too. The problem with and this is what happens, is that so abusers or toxic environments make you become dependent on them. That's how they exercise their control. And so a huge part of this is like exercising independence, which they're going to resist at every step of the way. So what I sort of recommend, what we usually do with patients, is that if you're in this kind of environment, you exercise small levels of independence, you start testing the waters. And they're going to resist, and you don't respond to their emotional blackmail. You kind of like neutral it, and then you kind of do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again. And eventually you'll start to learn some self-respect. And then you can even set more powerful boundaries. So with one person that I worked with, it was as simple as going on vacation by themselves. And then the family does all kinds of BS in response. They come back, passive-aggressive crap, cold shoulder. You kind of focus on your stuff. You let that behavior kind of, I don't know how to say this, just sort of fizzle out, right? Because when you respond to it, it increases. So you kind of stay a little bit stoic. You process your emotions with your therapist, and you let them do their passive-aggressive crap. The reason they keep doing it is because it works. If you don't let it work on you, they'll stop doing it. So you slowly test the boundaries. You kind of become a healthy adolescent. You become a teenager again. And if you're in a coercive control environment in a family business, chances are you never got to be a good teenager, right? You've been infantilized as an adult. So you got to be a teenager. So what if your trauma was not from abusive parents, but having very supportive parents and being lost after their guidance is no longer available? Yeah, right? So that sounds very similar. So in the environment of coercive control, there's a lack of autonomy. There is a lack of identity that gives you a compass. So you've got to be a little bit careful because there could be other things going on. But what I'm hearing is that you're lost and there's a lack of compass and there's a lack of autonomy. So those things are somewhat similar. So I think all that stuff kind of still relates. I still think it starts with maybe some degree of emotional integration. Okay. Sorry, I'm scrolling. All right, we've got... Okay, how is writing related to emotional integration? What a great question. So, the seminal work on this was from van der Kolk. So they did brain scans of people who suffered from trauma. And what they discovered is that there is hemispheric lateralization, which means that the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere get separated. There's a lot of activity in the right hemisphere where we experience emotions and then we kind of dissociate from them and then we can't really articulate them. And then we kind of like that whole pattern starts. So what we want to do is articulate our emotions. And when we articulate our emotions, it gives us some degree of power or integration over them. And so as we start to do things like write or journal, it allows us to articulate our emotions. And we just know from human beings that if you get a human being to voice and talk through their problems become more manageable. That's like fact. That's just how we work. And I think what it has to do with is that Broca's area, which is where our language center is, has a lot of connections to the parts of our brain that organize, plan, and execute tasks. So you can't explain something without understanding it. Understanding it makes it easy to act on. And so it's almost like the act of articulation forces you to understand it. And this is where, if you kind of think about it, there are two kinds of people. There are people who think to talk, and there are people who talk to think. People who think out loud. And I'm one of these people, where I know what I'm going to say sort of ahead of time, but half of what I say comes out and my neurons form the connections while I'm talking. And there's just something about like, beyond that, I don't know why, but we just know that these parts of the brain are connected. And we know that from an outcomes perspective, articulation leads to success. Dr. K, since we've never developed an autonomy, would we be acting like little children again? Absolutely. And even if you look at trauma therapists, what they'll sort of say is that when you experience a trauma, okay, so let's think about this. So if you've been traumatized and you don't know how to experience, and you're not independent, you're kind of feeling stuck, you can't drive yourself towards action. Do you need to start acting like a little kid again? Absolutely. So here's what we know. When people get traumatized, there's a part of their mind which gets frozen in time. And it almost halts some amount of our development. We become developmentally stunted. And so the process of healing trauma is sometimes very intentionally doing things that feel infantile or beneath our age. But just to give you all a couple of examples. So when we grow up in traumatic environments, we are not allowed to do trial and error. Our parents or caregivers or whatever will punish us for making a mistake. And if they're punishing us for making a mistake, We learn to fear trying. And so what do we look for? We look for perfection. I'm not going to try until I know I can fix it, or until I know it'll be success. And so we're paralyzed. We can't start because we need a guaranteed success before we get started. I'm not going to apply to college until I know I'm going to get into Harvard. I'm not going to sign up for the course until I know I can get an A+. And so what do you want to do? You want to behave like a child, because children don't always think things through. They're like, yeah, I'm going to stick my hand in this thing of oatmeal, and then I'm going to play with it. So absolutely, children, what children do, a child who is raised in a healthy way, 90% of what they do is trial and error. That's what they do. And so you should absolutely be more childlike. And give yourself the capacity to make mistakes. Because here you are, never taking the chance to make a mistake and screwing up your life. So make mistakes. Trial and error. Be childlike. Could we do more episodes on trauma? You're damn right. We're going to do more episodes. So we're going to do something about trauma. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's another stream. We've got a couple videos that we're going to be shooting that'll show up on YouTube. But !trauma to get added to our list for whatever else we decide to do. And this is where we're relying on y'all, because we're like doing we're asking people in our community and stuff, what do y'all need next? Do you want like more in-depth exploration of problems? Do you want to understand the physiology of it? Do you understand the gut microbiome? And can you change your diet to make all this crap easier? How do you form healthy relationships? What comes next? Are you going to do more? Absolutely. If I'm physically able to, I'm going to do more. I'm going to do way more. But what comes next? Y'all need to tell me. Are you going to make Dr. K's Guide to Trauma? Maybe. Right? So if that's what y'all need, that's what we'll build. And we can go into all this stuff in depth in a guide. Dr. K's Guide to the Magic When. We have to first figure out what we're going to do about trauma. Okay. We're going to help you fix your trauma a little bit, teach y'all how to form healthy relationships, and the Guide to Magic comes after that, right? Guide to Magic doesn't do any good if we're not able to form healthy relationships. Will there be a vote? Maybe there's going to be a lot more than a vote. We're going to do all kinds of assessments. So sign up, stay tuned. And if we email you because you signed up, please fill out the survey. Okay? We're like planning some stuff also to educate our coaches on some of these principles so that they can help y'all more with this. We're kind of working on all kinds of stuff. What survey? I don't know yet. We'll see. Okay. Let me look at one last thing. Okay. So there's a good question. Are emotions reactions, or do we react to emotions? Great question. The answer is actually both. So emotions are our brain's way of quickly reacting and orienting a response. So if we kind of think about, let's say I get attacked by someone, the emotion I may feel is fear or anger. And what's the purpose of fear and anger? It's so that my body knows what to do while I'm figuring out what is going on, right? So anger and fear are like modes of operation that require very quick action. So emotions are reactions to things in our environment. The tricky thing is that we then react to our emotions. So what do we do with the emotion? And especially when we're talking about trauma, what we see in trauma is something called emotion-focused coping. So if you grew up in a sort of traumatic environment, you have this sort of situation where if someone else was in control of your life, what that means is that you can't fix the problem, right? Because if your parents are mad at you and you're a child and they're adults and they're yelling at you, you can't make them stop. All you can do is change the way that you feel. You can't control their behavior, but you can dissociate from your own emotions. And so people who grow up in traumatic situations use something called emotion-focused coping, where they don't try to fix the problem, they try to fix their emotions. And this is why people end up in bad situations like abusive relationships, because in their mind, the only thing that you can do is change the way that you feel. You can't actually fix the problem. And this is also why people with trauma end up with things like addictions. Because what's a good way to fix the emotions that you feel? You can use drugs or alcohol or whatever. So emotions are both reactions to our environment and things that we react to. And the way that we react to them determines whether we end up using that emotion to fix the problem or that emotion uses us and drives us towards an unhealthy coping mechanism. Is it always bad to dissociate? No. The reason we dissociate is because it is good to dissociate. Dissociation is a protective mechanism of the mind to deal with overwhelming emotion. There are even studies that suggest that the mechanism of dissociation is similar to animals playing dead. So if an animal is about to be eaten, it plays dead. And then even if you inflict pain on the animal won't move. It is dissociating as a survival mechanism. Dissociation is a survival mechanism. The problem is that as we dissociate, we learn how to disconnect ourselves. And then as we become disconnected from ourselves, we can't find that fire of motivation. So what dissociation does is we trade progress for survival. That's what dissociation accomplishes. Makes it hard for us to move forward, but keeps us alive. Is maladaptive daydreaming a form of dissociation? Possibly. Is it accurate to see trauma as an equivalent to samskar? Absolutely. Can you get in control of dissociation? Sort of. What a good question. Why do people abuse others? So the number one reason that people abuse others is because that's what they were taught. On a more practical level, what does abuse create for a person? What is the benefit of abuse for someone? So when I abuse someone else, it usually fixes psychological things within me. So if I am afraid that someone will leave me, I will control that person. And in order to control that person, I will be abusive. And if I can control that person, and in order to control someone, you need to be abusive because that's what it takes to control another human being. Then what I do is if I'm in control of that person, then I no longer need to fear them leaving me. So what we oftentimes find is that abuse is a way to satisfy my psychological needs and insecurities. And why do I satisfy my needs and psychological securities that way as opposed to a healthier way? The number one answer for that is because that's what I was taught to do. That's what was done to me. Because when my parents had psychological needs and insecurities, they fulfilled them at the cost of my well-being. And so the game that I learned how to play, how do I get people from leaving me? I control them. Those are the rules of the game that I was taught. Okay. So it's like an infectious cycle? Sure. But I don't think it's infectious. It's just learning. It's how we're wired. It's not an infection. Why do we all say bruh? Bruh. 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 That's not an infection. Human beings learn from each other. It's a feature, not a bug. Right? Years from now, someone else is going to say something else. And then we'll all start saying that. Okay. Who are we rating, chat? Hassan, let's do it. All right, y'all. Thank you very much for coming today. From the bottom of my heart, I hope this has been helpful to you. Yeah. Thank you for coming today. Just a couple of quick reminders. If y'all are interested in this kind of stuff and want to do more, sign up with !trauma. We're doing a lot of what we're trying to do high value stuff for Mental Health May this year. So we're trying to make about 12 to 14 really strong pieces of content that will help people substantially. So we really appreciate all the support that y'all give us. Support, if you guys, want to try something like coaching and stuff like that, you should absolutely do it. It's kind of full right now. It's been full for a while. It tends to work pretty well and people get a lot of value out of it. But you feel free to join the wait list and try to snag a spot. For those of y'all that really liked the in-depth content today, that's why we built Dr. K's guide. So it's like more than what I can do in one day. So, each guide has 20 plus, maybe 30-ish videos and also has things like worksheets and exercises and stuff like that. So feel free to check that stuff out. And, the funds that come in from the guide are used to build other guides. So huge shout out to everyone who has purchased Dr. K's guide already. We had people purchase our first 3 guides, so we built a bigger guide as number 4. And if y'all want us to build more on things like trauma and addiction, we can absolutely do that. So thank y'all very much. We also recognize that there are some of y'all for whom the price isn't right, or maybe the topic isn't right, or things like that. And so that's why we do things like stream on Twitch for free, upload stuff to YouTube on free. 99% of our content and services and Discord events and stuff like that are free. So we're with you there, that not everyone can afford stuff, and we're committed to trying to make that stuff as accessible as possible, which is why it really helps, and we're really grateful to everyone who donates, subscribes, things like that, because that helps. The last thing is that, that y'all can do for us is, if this is helpful to you, tell your friends. So we also earn some degree of revenue on Twitch and YouTube and stuff like that. And so if you find this useful, let other people know. And just like watch our videos and stuff, because the more that we can kind of do that, the more we can get, right? So if YouTube wants to pay us because advertisers want to pay YouTube, or advertisers want to pay Twitch and Twitch wants to pay us, that works too. So we're going to build whatever we can for you with the resources at our disposal. At this point, I guess you can say this is my life's work. Like, I quit my job and I spent about 20 to 25 hours preparing a 90-minute lecture on trauma. Why did it take so long? It's because to explain something complex in 90 minutes, that's how long it takes. I think it's Mark Twain who said, I apologize for writing you a long letter. It would have been shorter if I had the time. I think that's Mark Twain, or everything is attributed to Mark Twain. So a big part of our process is to try to distill tons of stuff like research papers and stuff like that into digestible pieces. So this is what I do now, and I'm grateful that I can do it. And the reason that I can do it is because of y'all, right? We would not be here today without you. So take care, y'all. Thank you for everything. And, just let us know what y'all are up to. And good luck with everything. And I guess we're raiding Hassan, someone said. Oh, no. Okay. Let me see. Who do y'all want to raid, chat? Miskif? Fine. There we go. You know what's what's kind of wild, chat, is that sometimes you forget what your channel name is.
Hey, did your raid go through already?
Nope.
Raid Sidian.
Okay.
She's playing with ammunition. She just started.
Okay, we're gonna raid. Oh no. Chat. We're gonna raid Sidian. And in honor of trauma, she's playing Redfall. Oh my goodness. I've heard such traumatic things about this game. Have you all played it, chat? Is it as bad as everyone says? So False Western 88 is saying Redfall is clapped. I don't know what that means, bruh. Okay, well, send Sidian some love, but the good kind, okay, not the traumatic kind, chat. And we'll see y'all, I don't know, stay tuned to our stuff, because we don't know what we're doing, because we're trying to do a lot of stuff. So, stay tuned. Love y'all, take care, have a good weekend.